need to hit that. Okay, great. And just thank you once again for all of you for being with us today for this next edition of our Future of Engineering Roundtable series. We are excited to share insights from the new economic forecast report with you. We shared it at the fall conference a few weeks ago at a very high level, and we are excited to have Joe and Ken with us today to dig into what that all really means. First, I'd like to thank the contributors of the ACEC Research Institute who make our research possible, and as always, for your continued support. We are here to share some great stuff with you, so I will go ahead and turn it over to Joe and Ken to get us started. Joe, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Carrie, and welcome everybody. Very happy to have you back with us today if you've been with us before, and a great welcome to those who are new to this particular roundtable. Excuse me. This is the third year that we've conducted this study, and so we're going to be sharing with you all of the most up-to-date information we have about the state of the economic situation in the industry, as well as the forecast looking forward 5 years. Ken McGill is one of our, he's our lead economist, so we're very happy to have him here today. He's going to be talking through most of the research with us today. What we're going to cover today are a handful of things. One, we're going to look at 2021 a little bit in the rearview mirror, see how we did there in recovering from the pandemic, understand how big the industry is and what it means to the U.S. economy. Then we're going to look at the forecast and what lies ahead. And of course, we'll have some key takeaways at the end. We have a lot of data to share with you, but keep in mind that this is really only the highlights of the full report. We have a QR code that will lead you to the report itself at the end of this presentation. And so be sure that you do capture that at the end so you can get all the insights that we have available to you. As Carrie said, please feel free to submit a question in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken to get us started. Ken, let's take a look at how we did in 2021.
Great, Joe, thanks. And I'll add my welcome and appreciation for everyone allowing us to be part of their afternoon today. As Joe mentioned a moment ago, we're going to go through quite a bit of data and slides, and he and I will do our best, absolute best, to make it as interesting as possible. But I would urge you to keep in mind that the data we're showing you here is really the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more involved in the creation of, and so much more available to you with the report. I'd urge you to click on that QR code and have a look at the larger report. It'll probably answer a lot of questions that will come to mind later, and maybe even add some more depth and breadth to your understanding of some of the top line numbers that Joe and I will go through. So let's kick it off, as Joe said, by taking a look at the historic view of the industry based upon nominal output. You see that word nominal output in the heading of the graph. Nominal output is a government convention. They use the word output, but it's essentially the same thing as the descriptions that we understand and use daily for revenue or sales. So when you see the word output, that's really what we're talking about here. We keep it in the document because we want to be true to the ultimate source, which in this case is the federal government. You take a look at the history of engineering and design services revenue, I'll use that word, and you can see where we've come since 2008. A couple of things to point out. Let's take our eyes to the extreme right end and pat ourselves on the back for a tremendous 2021. The industry grew nearly 10%, achieved $373 billion in revenue, and more than recovered from the hurt that we all took with the pandemic. The other thing I'd point out is at 373, we've already recovered to our, let's say, previous peak of 2019. So as bad as the pandemic year was in 2020, that's as good as 2021 turned out to be. If you go to the left side of the chart, you can see what happened when the last time we had a recession. It took 6 years to recover to the previous peak. So we were very busy in 2021, both numerically, and I'm sure those of you out there serving the market had a tremendous year as well. Now, why did 2021 turn out to be such a dramatically positive year? I mean, part of it is the math of the decline and the recovery from it. But there were a lot of things happening out there that conspired to provide a tailwind for the industry. One is just the sheer size of the fiscal and monetary stimulus going on in the economy as the federal government and other agencies try to stimulate economic activity to get us through the pandemic recession. Another reason, solid demand for construction activity, be it on the res or the non-res side. That continued, that started in 2020, it continued throughout virtually all the year 2021 and a good bit of 2022 as well. Other things that helped, corporate profits were strong. Consumer balance sheets were strong. Therefore, consumer spending was very strong, even through the COVID year. And then finally, at the very end of 2021, we got the passage of the IIJA, and there were, we had a little bit of time for some of that money to be released. Admittedly, most of that, or much of the stimulus began in 2022. Okay, this chart looks at some of the differences between 2021 and 2022. The growth rates are in green, the levels are inside the boxes. Just a quick look, we just observed that industry revenue at 373 grew 9.7%. Job growth in our industry grew 2.1% to 1.53 or almost 1.54 million jobs. The number of businesses actually grew. Establishments grew by 4.3%. I'll have some comments on that in a moment as well. Go to the right side, wages were up 3%. The industry's direct contribution to the US economy went up more than 10%, 11.3 to be exact. And to the government's benefit, both federal, state, and local, collections from our industry went up 11.3%. Now, a couple of interesting things to say here. Revenue went up 10%, but jobs only went up 2%. That is very atypical. Job growth is usually slower than revenue growth. That is an economic fact, but the gap is usually not that wide. And as an economist, we peel the onion and dig through some of the more detailed data to get a flavor as to why that took place. One reason is there's always a bit of a lag between job growth and revenue growth. That happens first. Firms want to see their top line growing before they take the risk of adding more employees. So there's a bit of a lag that suggests that in 2022, we'll have some catch up that takes place there. The other reason I think is just labor shortages and labor constraints. And I'm sure everyone on the call today can relate to that. Finding good talent is very difficult in this job market. And clearly 2021, you see that jobs could only expand 2.1%. With revenue expanding 10%, I'm sure that many of you out there would have loved to find even more employees. In other words, it became a bit of a constraint on growth. Our guess is that the 9.7% would have been significantly higher if there were more abundant labor out there. Total establishments growing 4.3%. That's the fastest growth rate in new establishments in about 6 or 7 years. Why is that? A lot of that has to do with the constraints in the labor market. Many people use the COVID slowdown as an opportunity, essentially, to reassess things. We saw a lot of early retirements. We saw people changing careers, and we saw a lot of folks maybe finally, using that opportunity to take the leap and start their own companies. And I think that has something to do with that establishment growth rate that we're seeing there. Wages went up only 3%, but buckle your seatbelts, because I think we're in for a couple of years here in the future where that number will be much higher. If you're an employee, that's a great thing. If you're an employer, yeah, that's going to add to your wage bill. Couple of other things. The GDP growth at 11.3%, and this is the direct contribution of our industry to US GDP at 213 billion. It's an impressive result in 2021. It's faster than revenue growth for a number of reasons. Its productivity's higher, wages are higher, and profits actually were better as well. So that's one reason why that is a couple of clicks higher than revenue itself. Taxes are also up 11.3%. The reason that's up higher than revenue has to do with income taxes and other kinds of taxes that are paid by either employers or employees in our sector that click you into a slightly higher bracket. So there's a little more growth there.
Ken, there's a couple of things I wanted to also mention on this slide. One is that the growth in the wages is obviously, about on par with prior years, the long-term average at 2 or 3%. And as you said, we're seeing wage pressure building. We see that in the sentiment surveys that we are conducting among ACEC member firms. The other aspect of this that I think is very interesting is that we're setting these are high paying jobs, right? The median average household income is around $60,000 right now, and these are salaries for one position. So these are really, really good paying jobs that our industry is creating. One question for you, Ken, from the audience. Someone has mentioned that we've been doing this for 3 years now. How did 2021 end up overall compared to what we thought was going to happen before 2021 happened?
Great question, and it always comes up when you do an outlook like this, Joe. Our projection last year was 8.1% growth in industry revenue. So we were a little light, given that the actual came in at 9.7. I think what happened is just some of these positives or tailwinds that we anticipated were actually stronger in 2021 than we thought at that same time or this time last year.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, Ken. Well, that was a great overview of sort of where we've been and where we've come from. Let's take a look at how important our industry is to the economy.
Okay. Let's start off with a little overhead on this slide. There's a lot of pictures here and some numbers. I think I can put them in perspective for you. The first thing to consider when you examine the economic significance of our industry is that this is not the economic significance of the construction sector. Obviously, that's the biggest end market for our members. However, the value that we provide to construction is really a part of their economic footprint. So I think you'll have more perspective on that in a moment. But I think the best way to go through this is to start at the left and go towards the right. The left is the numbers that we've just gone through. So you recognize $373 billion and 9.7% growth. The contribution number to the US economy, 11.2, I think we had 11.3 in the last slide, percent growth at 558 billion. Now, 558 billion is a good bit more than 373. How does that happen? Why is our footprint larger than our revenue? The answer is simple. Our footprint is a function of three things. One, our own activity in the industry, our revenue, our employees, and the provision of engineering and design services in the market. But it's also a function of the upstream businesses that we buy from, and the downstream businesses that our employees and our ownership support. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the indirect and induced box that you see in the third column there at 345 billion includes two things. I mean, one, it includes indirect activity, which is another way of saying it's the engineering and design services supply chain. Now, granted, our industry, our companies are mostly about labor and employment, but we do buy a lot of materials, supplies, and services to support our end markets. Well, that purchase is basically a supply chain upstream issue, and that gets added to our economic footprint to the tune of about $126 billion in 2021. Now, as companies, we pay our wages, and our supply chain people pay their employees and wages. Those employees go out into the market and buy all of the things that you and I buy every day. That too is part of our economic footprint. It's called the induced impact, but it's really just about us spending our wages in the market. That, to the tune of $219 billion, is how we get to 345. We've summed those two together. And to Joe's point a moment ago, because our industry has higher than average wages, our economic footprint is, as a result, much larger than many other industries in the economy. The other box down there at 4.7 million AE-supported jobs. Let's talk about that for a moment. Jobs are really, again, part of the direct story where we employed 1.54 million people in our activities. But when we add in the jobs that we support in the supply chain and the jobs that we support downstream as wages are spent, that total is 4.7 million. And by the way, that's 3.8% of all employment in the United States. Think about that for a moment. We have a very large footprint because of what we do, because of the wages that we pay our employees, and the amount of supply chain activity that we generate. To the far right are tax contributions. Here too, we make outsized contributions, both to the federal and the state and local level. 77 billion, that's a function of taxes like income, Social Security, certain federal excises. That sums to 77 billion. When we drop down to the state and local tax contribution level, there are income taxes there as well, but that's where sales taxes that we pay, or other kinds of excises that we pay, or even property taxes that are paid. And that sums to 37 billion when you look across the United States. By the way, that 37 billion, if we decided to use it all to pay for public schools, we could educate 2.4 million US students. So again, I want to stress our footprint is quite large because of what we do and who we are in terms of economics.
I have a good question here from the audience. I think it actually sets us up quite nicely for the next slide. Do we have this data by state?
We absolutely do, Joe. One other thing I did want to say about the slide before, could you jump back to that, Joe? Is that a?
Yep, sure, no problem.
Thank you. When you look at 373 billion on the far left, and then you look at our contribution at 558 billion, just doing some simple math, that means every dollar that is spent on engineering and design services, or AE industry revenue, generates $1.50 in the US economy. Our multiplier, in other words, is positive, and it's about 1.5. That is impressive. Not many industries can make that claim. Okay, you can switch, Joe. Thank you.
All right.
And to answer your question you posed before, absolutely. We look at this by state. And you can see that color coding here gives you a sense of who the largest states are in the darkest colors on down to the smaller states with lighter blue. That economic footprint is very significant in virtually every state. Some of the numbers are large simply because their economies are large, and we've got lots of members there and lots of construction activity to support. But make no mistake, when you look at this, this is not an exercise in taking $373 billion and simply allocating it based upon revenue or population or some sort of simple scalar. This is the result of looking at some very significant things that make states different. I mean, for one important thing, firms that are in these states engaged in our industry services do businesses outside of states. And for that draws more income into their state and draws more AE activity essentially into the state. Another thing that makes states different is the more diverse the economy of a state, the less need there is to import the materials, supplies, and services, and labor, I guess you could say, into the state to support the AE activity in the state. So that state can grow faster in our footprint if their economy is diverse. And then finally, you recall our conversation a moment ago where high wages lead to impressive numbers on the induced economic effect because there's more spending that someone in a higher income bracket can engage in. Well, that separates some of these states from one another simply because our sector in some of these states pay even higher wages. And for that reason, their induced effect is that much higher. Likewise with taxes. Taxes also are part of the study. We don't have a map here for you today, but I urge you to take a look at those numbers. Those differences among the states also have to do with all the things I just mentioned, but also each state has a different tax structure. And we had to consider that when really looking at the tax contribution that our sector makes to each state.
So Ken, just a reminder to the audience, the full report has this information as well as the wages by state, tax revenue by state. Is there anything else I'm forgetting?
Wages, jobs, Joe.
Jobs, right.
Yeah,
so
jobs.
lots of great detail by state in that full report. So you definitely want to take a look at that. So Ken, we've sort of set the stage here. We've looked at the past and seen how we've recovered from the pandemic. We're doing quite nicely right now. We have a very important function in the economy overall, perhaps one of the largest. We're bigger than the oil and gas industry and many other large industries that people know about and can name, companies off the top of their head. So let's take a look at what lies ahead and where we're going in terms of our forecast.
Absolutely. Okay, this is a bar chart similar to the one that we began today's session with, and it shows the history of industry revenue from 2017 on out through our projections to 2027. The projections are in black, of course. The historic numbers are in blue. Some of those you'll recognize right away. The 2021 number at $373 billion, for example. Virtually throughout this period, we've had mostly positive tailwind behind us from an economic and an industry and an end market standpoint. The single exception is the 2020 pandemic year. But as we noted before, we've recovered from that. The question really for this section of the presentation is, where are we going from here? And given the economic fundamentals right now, and given the fact that here we're sitting with 2 or 3 quarters of 2022's numbers already in hand, we're pretty confident in our projection for 2022 at $413 billion, or 11% growth. Now, that's an impressive figure. It's the fastest growth rate we've had since we began recording this revenue historic information back in 2000. So we are living through essentially a record year in activity for our industry. Now, why is that? Well, part of it, as I said before, is the continuation of the recovery from the pandemic, but there are also fundamentals out there that are at work, tailwinds in the construction sector, tailwinds in even some of the other end markets that are created essentially by an economy that's doing relatively well. Unfortunately, some of the reason why we've achieved $413 billion has to do with inflation. This is not a look at real growth, it's a look at nominal growth. Below that in the table, you can see the real growth. So if we strip out inflation, the 11% falls quite a bit. About 7 points of that 11 was due to rising prices. Still, 3% real growth is impressive. And there are many, many industries in our economy that could not say they achieved that level of performance. Now, when we look forward into this forecast, things are mostly positive. The growth rates are decelerating. You can see that in the table below the bar chart. But while we look at this with essentially a positive outlook, there are some risks out there that we all need to consider. And many of them you're living right now. I probably don't need to remind you of them, but they're part of our thinking as we go through this projection to come up with our best guess as to where the industry's going. Those risks are simply, there's about 6 of them that I'll throw out there for discussion. The first one is labor shortages. We've been talking a little bit about that, where we're concerned that literally not being able to find enough employees, particularly engineers, is going to be a constraint on growth moving forward. Still growth, but a restraint on that growth. Inflation continues to be a problem. Now, when I say that, I'm talking more about inflation's impact on consumer spending. For the most part, we can pass off some, if not all, of the cost side inflation that we get, with some argument maybe about wages. But inflation's risk here is that it will continue to be pervasive throughout the economy, and for that reason, essentially result in a reduction in real income for consumers. We have the risk of rising wages. That does cut into profits, as we all know, and for that reason, that's part of the risk profile of this outlook. We also have supply chain risk out there. For a while there, it didn't matter how much we might be willing to pay. Important materials, services, and supplies simply weren't available. A resumption or an increase in that supply chain risk could impact this outlook negatively. It could immediately provide a headwind to the level that we even saw in 2020. Typically, supply chain problems are created by geopolitical events, and the war in Ukraine was the big contributor, as well as the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Rising interest rates are a risk. We think we know what the Fed's going to do, and then Chairman Powell and the rest of them surprise us from time to time. They have stated publicly many times that their #1 priority right now is fighting inflation. That's a good thing, but it results in them continuing to raise rates. And when they raise interest rates in the economy, credit gets more expensive, consumer balance sheets are hurt, and housing affordability is slammed as well. That essentially, you could argue right now that the housing sector is already in a recession as a direct result of the actions that the Fed has taken to tame inflation. The last risk is simply the risk of a recession, more a stronger recession, let's say, than we're anticipating, looking at conditions that we see at this moment. Yes, Joe.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No,
you
no.
there. So we've got a couple questions coming in from the audience. One of these you just touched on is the Fed raising of interest rates. Does the forecast include what you anticipate the Fed is going to do in terms of how long it will continue to raise rates and when it will stop?
Absolutely, it does. And so far, the Fed is tracking with what we expected. We'll see how that evolves as we get into 2023 and maybe especially 2024. I mean, the fact that last month's CPI reading was 7.7%, for those of you that keep an eye on those things in the media, is a good thing, because the rate is beginning to fall. And that makes the market believe, and to some extent the Fed believe, that inflation is beginning to moderate. Armed with that piece of information, it's more likely then that the Fed will raise rates because they don't believe the job is over yet, but they'll raise them by fewer and fewer basis points. For example, the last increase was 75 basis points. And this time, because of that 7.7 reading and some other indicators, our expectation for December's increase is going to be 50 basis points.
Okay, great, Ken. The next question, again, it's a great tee up for the next slide, but in the forecast, what's the impact of the IIJA? Would we have a forecast contraction without it? Are you ready to move to the next slide, Ken?
Let's do it.
All right.
And the first thing I'd say is that's a great question, one that we thankfully anticipated. So we put this slide together for everyone to show our projection with and without the impact of the IIJA. So the dotted line is essentially what the industry's performance would look like through 2025 anyway, if we didn't have the IIJA. So if you take the area between those two lines, the sum total of that 5-year period is about $132 billion. So to say that the IIJA is significant or provides a significant boost to our industry is a complete understatement. It is significant. Yes, granted, it's mostly public infrastructure at this point, but $132 billion in revenue that will result in $132 billion in our industry is a significant tailwind.
And these again are nominal figures, correct, Ken?
That's correct, Joe.
So if you were to factor inflation into this, would you see negative real growth over the forecast horizon without the IIJA, or would it be more or less flat?
No, I believe there'd still be real growth.
Okay.
It would, well, I guess we'd have to look at that to be more precise. There may be a year or two where we would dip negative, but I don't think the negatives would be all that significant.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it's important because there are a lot of firms that are really focused only in the private markets, and they may not see the benefits of IIJA, certainly not the direct benefits. And we're seeing right now, as you mentioned, a recession beginning to occur in the residential real estate market. The commercial real estate market isn't doing much better right now. So I think, what individual firms might see in terms of how they are impacted over the next 5 years will very much be a reflection of how diversified those firms are and how much exposure to the public sector they have versus the private sector.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The $132 billion that we see in the IIJA is it's basically about 6 cents of every dollar spent on public infrastructure results in revenue for engineering and design services. But if you're not participating in those end markets at all, there's still organic growth in the industry taking place anyway. It just goes back to that question as to how much of it is inflation during that period and how much of it is real growth. My guess is that as inflation moderates, it will moderate in our industry as well, of course, and real growth will begin to catch up rapidly to nominal growth.
Okay. So Ken, you mentioned quite a few different risks to the forecast, both upside and downside. I know we have some slides here so that you can sort of dive into those areas a little bit further.
I do, and I'll try and go through them quickly and not to belabor any of these points. Labor shortages is an extreme challenge that all of us will have to face, whether you're working solely in public infrastructure or not. You've got to hire high quality professional employees, and that has been for a while getting very difficult. The graph on the left is takes a look at the number of job openings relative to the number of new hires in professional and business services, which granted includes more than our industry, but it's the best data that's published out there that speaks to our condition. I did look up the number before I came on. The September number is 1.7. So that gap has not improved just quite yet. On the right, we're talking about compensation. And of course, wage growth, I said a moment ago, buckle in. We're going to see some pretty rapid wage growth in the next couple of years. Part of that has to do with success in revenue and business activity. But it's that success in the face of labor shortages that will push that number up dramatically. The Q3 number just came out as well, and it again is 4.7%. So we haven't seen any improvement there yet, and things may get a little worse there even before they get better.
One of the things, Ken, I know that we've talked about before is that the IIJA will result in an additional 82,000 jobs being needed on top of what would have already been a growing industry. So that, I think, again, just underscores the tight labor market we're experiencing. And it certainly isn't unique to our industry, but it certainly is a challenge for firms.
Which is a great segue to the next slide, Joe. We work well together. The chart on the left just tracks direct jobs in our industry from 2015 to 2022. You can see that in 2022, with much of the year already recorded, jobs are expected to grow to 1.62 million. That's about a 5.2% gain in 2022. So we're already out there trying to hire as many folks as we can. The difference, you recall a moment ago, between, let's say, an 11% growth rate in revenue for 2022 and a 5% increase in employment, there again, we still have that big gap. Some of that difference is being made up in productivity gains. And that's kind of what you're seeing in the chart of the right. Suddenly, productivity dropped a bit, but now in 2021, it jumped way up by 5.2%. Fortunately or not, that's a cloudy picture to some extent, because some of that productivity is not what we traditionally think of as, oh, you give someone a better tool and they can do more with it. There's some of that, no doubt, but a lot of this is people working longer hours. A lot of overtime going on. And we're using that right now to plug the gap, if you will. It's just a temporary fix, however, because productivity rates of growth, 5.2%, as you can see just in the history that's there now, it's not really sustainable. We need more people, or we need more true investments in technology that makes people more productive.
Ken, with this constraint on labor and the potential for going into a recession next year for the economy as a whole? We're not looking at a recession within our industry, given the data you shared with us, but will that help to ease the labor shortage a little bit, or not really?
You mean a general economic recession?
Well, to the industry and specifically, obviously, as if we have a recession, we'll see a rising unemployment rate. But is that going to be seen within our industry or not?
Well, I think it could help on the margin. If other industries are not doing very well or as well as ours is, we've got more power, in a sense, to attract some of their employees. So that could reduce some of the, frankly, the burden we have in terms of productivity, but also maybe some of the wage pressure that we would expect to see otherwise.
So in terms of engineers, maybe who have gone to other sectors, other industries, they may be enticed to come back to our industry. Is that correct? Okay.
That's essentially, yes, that's one scenario that would make economic sense, let's say, in a situation where our industry is outperforming so many others in the economy.
Okay.
I think I did some back of the envelope math. Keep that slide up, Joe, please.
Sure.
I did some back of the envelope math that I thought was interesting and probably everyone can relate to on the call. If the IIJA generates the requirement for about 83,000 or 82,000 more employees over the 5-year period, just looking at simple math, about 20,000 of those will need to be engineers. And when you look at the organic growth that would take place in the industry anyway, that will add about another 70,000 plus engineers that we're going to need in this sector. Right now, according to a number of sources that I found out on the web, we're graduating about 70,000 engineers a year. And by that, I mean primarily civil and mechanical. So you look at that and think, yeah, we're going to need more engineers in the future, both to meet the growth that we see already happening and also to sustain the industry for years beyond that. So what do you do about that? I think it would, as an economist, I'll throw this out. There are only a few places you can go. One is that we need to graduate more engineers. So workforce programs and agreements and working with universities would make a lot of sense right now in the industry. The second one would be immigration. Bring some more engineers in from outside the United States. The third one would be to increase our industry's share of those 70,000 graduates that come out every year. Maybe we have to pay more or some other form of compensation. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. And the last one is to potentially invest in technology. This might be a good time to look at more technological solutions to take on some of the challenges that right now, anyway, we're using labor to meet.
And that's a good point, Ken, because I know that technology has been a focus for ACEC over the last year, and we published a study on how firms are using technology. So that's another plug for some research that we have out there available to all of you watching today.
Very timely, given the numbers we're looking at.
All right, Ken, are we ready to move to the next slide on the supply chain?
Let's move.
All right.
I mentioned a while ago that the supply chain continues to be a risk. I will say that the risk has abated a bit in the last year, and I think the prospects for supply chain pressure are looking much better than they were just even a year ago. All bets are off if Ukraine or we have another pandemic or some geopolitical or external event causes transportation and manufacturing issues across the world again. That index that you see there is an amalgam of indicators in manufacturing and in transportation around the world. And you can see it drop from its high of 4.3 down to 147 in less than a year's time. So manufacturing and transportation, shipping especially, are catching up. And that's good news. you can see that impact on producers' prices, another form of inflation, on the table on the right. So we're also already seeing prices in plywood, soft lumber are falling, and some of these other prices, though they look very high in, I think that was about mid-year when these numbers were pulled, they're still very high, but they're coming down for the most part. We'll see some moderation there.
And I know there were a lot of articles, Ken, during the pandemic and then after the Ukraine crisis started, that we were having a shortage of shipping containers. There just weren't even enough containers, and there also weren't enough people at the ports to unload containers that were sitting on ships in the harbors. But I just read an article this week, Ken, that said we're actually now entering into a surplus of shipping containers. So I think that anecdotal evidence really helps support the data that, hey, we're starting to really come out of the supply chain issues that we've had. Not that they're over completely, but they're definitely easing.
Yeah, I would agree. So that's a headwind that's not nearly as forceful as it had been.
Yeah.
As we look forward.
Well,
Okay.
Ken, we talked a little bit about the Fed and what they're going to do next. So you said that you think at their next meeting in December, it's going to be a 50 basis point increase. So where's that going to take us here on the chart?
Well, on this chart, probably by the time the Fed stops raising rates and feels as though the battle against inflation has been largely won, we'll be at the end of 2023, maybe even at the beginning of 2024. So think about that for a moment. You look at a chart like this, and essentially from 2020 through the beginning of 2022, the Fed had interest rates at essentially zero. And a lot of that was their contribution to stimulating the economy to get us through the pandemic. Now that and some other things that we've talked about, supply chain, et cetera, has created an inflationary issue, problem, which they began to attack right away. And you can see that in that the way the graph at the extreme right has stepped up since that point in February of 2022. So now the Fed funds target rate is about 4%. And if we're right about our expectation, it'll go up another 1.25%. And then all of a sudden, I think then Chairman Powell and the Fed will stop, and they'll wait maybe 1, 2, 3 meetings and do essentially nothing. And at that point, they may find they'll need to actually begin to lower rates.
Do you think the risk is that they're going to overshoot, or I mean, that's been talked about a lot in the press lately, or do you think they're actually on the right pace?
I think they're doing quite well, given the indicators that they watch closely. If you think about it, there are a lot of folks out there that follow the Fed. They follow the Fed's every move. And sometimes the people that complain about the fact that they're moving too quickly or not quickly enough have an axe to grind. They have there's a dog in some race that it's better for them if they can get the Fed to moderate or maybe even be more aggressive. It depends on, their point of view. But I think it's hard to argue that so far anyway, they haven't been prudent. And at the same time, I think they have considered and tried to navigate that soft landing that everyone talks about in the media. Our expectation, we've discussed this before, we do believe that a modest recession is in the offing because of these rate increases. But thus far, that recession has actually been downgraded in our minds and extended out in time. So to answer your question directly, Joe, our feeling is that the Fed's doing a pretty good job right now of focusing on inflation without derailing the economy. One key evidence of that, a couple of things. One is consumer spending has continued to be strong. Consumer sentiment is actually stronger than you'd think it would be at this point in time. And look at the labor market. We're continuing to create jobs at a decelerating rate. Yes, actually, that's a good thing for the Fed because that's what they want to see. it'll make them believe they need to be less aggressive going forward. So the economy is doing relatively well. Yeah, we'd all like to see inflation brought down quickly, but that's a tall order in an economy as diverse as ours, and a global economy too. Inflation comes from largely outside the US. We have to respond to it rather than drive it.
So you mentioned the potential for a recession and that you're moderating that recession. So, we did have 2 quarters this year of negative GDP, but it was not called a technical recession because of the labor market and how well the economy really is doing overall. But what is that looking like towards the end of next year, and how confident are you in there being a recession?
Well, I'll just start off by saying that those of you that look at this graph in the report, so if you look at the QR code and pull it out, we've actually changed it since we put the report out, and it needs to be changed. There are some things that have occurred in the economy that that cause us to believe things are going to be slightly different anyway. To your point, Joe, you could argue that 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth is a technical recession, but beyond, we really haven't discussed it as that, in part because the labor market continued to grow, and in part because when you peel the onion and look at the reasons for those 2 negative quarters, it largely had to do with inventories. And inventories swing, any one quarter, inventories can swing wildly in one direction or the other. It just depends on whether firms are depleting inventories or adding to them. And for that reason, those 2 negative quarters didn't make it to the, didn't make muster and allowed us to call it a recession. Quarter 3 looks like 2.6%, so we're back in growth mode. Our expectation is that we'll continue to eke out some growth through the second quarter of next year, at which point we will see a modest recession beginning in quarter 3. It will only go 2 quarters. So if I extended this out to our expectation for 2024, the first quarter of 2024 is actually positive again. And by the way, our expectation for inflation says that by the first quarter of 2024, the core PCE rate, which is what the Fed watches, will be back down into their 2 to 3% target range. So it will be sort of mission accomplished at that point.
So Ken, we talked a lot about public versus private, and different markets may do better than others. What can you tell us from this slide about where are the winners going to be and where are the losers?
Well, absolutely. This slide helps us sort of peel things down, dig a little deeper. It's one thing to talk about the performance of the industry, but our ability to respond in the industry, and frankly, even from a numbers perspective, the way we understand the industry to be able to make some of these projections is to break it down by end market and see where things are growing or not, and consider how large those markets are. So this bubble chart is our attempt to sort of give everyone a sense of which markets are the largest for ED services, and how quickly we expect them to grow over the next 4 or 5 years. So as any 4-quadrant graph would go, those that are in the top right-hand corner are both large: state, street and highways, power, education. They're both large, and they're expected to grow quite well during that period. So in that vernacular, I guess we call those end markets the winners. But I would point out that there are some markets there that are expected to decline, but are still very large: manufacturing, commercial, and office, to be exact. There are also some other end markets that are growing rapidly, but they're not quite as large as some of the ones that are in the extreme top right-hand corner. For example, wastewater, transportation, sewage, and the like. So when you look at those end markets, it sort of gives you a sense of how the economy will evolve over the next 4 or 5 years, and where the end market power will come from for our sector, our industry.
So Ken, we've got a a really, really interesting question here. I don't know if you'll know an answer or have an answer, but we've been talking a lot about domestic here. Just this is the U.S. focus. Do you have any information on the international market and what the prospects are for U.S. firms that are working abroad?
Well, export, I think, if I recall, in some of the databases we have, exports are about 10%, I think, of industry revenue. And if that's the case, you know, it's almost like we could do a bubble chart here for country markets. And it's going to be a function because they all won't go through a recession at the same time at the same rate. So some countries are in better economic shape right now and may be able to avoid some of the risks that we've even identified for the US market. In those situations, looking at potential export to those markets would make a lot of sense. In a way, I guess I'd love to take a look at that data and add that bubble to this chart and call that an end market. We just didn't do that because of the, as you said, the nature of the domestic versus international data.
Okay.
But I would say that export is probably a good market to examine both for its long-term prospects and maybe in the short term, if you can find certain regions of the world that are a little more resilient as we go through the potential recession ahead.
So Ken, we've only got a few minutes left. We've talked about a lot of data here, a lot of numbers. Let's sum it up for our audience and give them those key takeaways.
Okay, well, I think the biggest takeaway is just that things look pretty great for our industry going forward, albeit with those risks that we've been talking about, labor shortages, inflation, and some of the others. I think that as the US economy goes, we will continue to lead with respect to performance indicators. So that's a takeaway. That's a piece of good news, I think. We need to keep an eye, however, on these risks. And the labor shortage is one that I would argue we should be working on anyway, both from a long-term and short-term goal perspective. Inflation, yeah, it looks like it's beginning to moderate. That's good news. I would keep my eye on that as well, however, because it could kick up again if we had a geopolitical event involving, let's say, oil prices again. Labor costs, I'm sorry to say this to everyone, but I think we're going to go through a couple, 3 years of some pretty challenging labor cost increases, simply because there's a shortage of the number and kind of people that we need out there. And then lastly, I think our base case is still for a mild or even modest recession that begins at the end of 2023 and literally just goes a couple of quarters, and then we'll get right back on track.
So Ken, thank you so much. This has been really, really helpful to the audience today. I also want to mention that, you know, we're going to be updating our forecast again next year, later in the year. But between now and then, we are going to continue to conduct our quarterly sentiment survey with firms in the industry. And that's giving us a lot of great, more high frequency data that we can share in terms of how firms are doing and where there might be some pain points and where we're, you know, things are easing up a little bit. So I urge everyone to keep their eye out for that. We'll have the fourth quarter sentiment results in a couple weeks in December. So keep your eye out for that roundtable. And then we answered every question that came in. So thank you so much to those of you who did answer questions today. And I'm going to throw it back to Carrie to close us out with a few remarks.
Thanks, Joe and Ken. And I can't turn my camera back on because I'm not the host. So I apologize for that. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kevin, for your time, and everyone else for joining us this afternoon. Thank you once again to our contributors to the ACEC Research Institute. Without your support, research and webinars like these would not be possible. Wanted to invite everyone to join us for our next roundtable, which is on December 7th, which will be our QBS workshop. So invite everyone to join and attend. You can find the registration link for that, as well as all the links to our research reports at acecresearchinstitute.org. With that, everyone have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.